January 1919. The north end of Boston, Massachusetts. It was a densely packed, bustling neighborhood filled with hardworking Italian and Irish immigrants. The First World War had officially ended just a few months prior, but the massive, grinding industrial machine of America was still churning loudly along the eastern seaboard. It was a freezing, unforgiving winter, and the narrow cobblestone streets were crowded with heavy horse-drawn freight wagons, roaring elevated trains, and large families simply trying to survive the harsh realities of the early 20th century. But towering over this vibrant, innocent community, right on the edge of the waterfront at Commercial Street, stood a colossal, unnatural structure. It was a massive steel storage tank owned and operated by the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, a subsidiary of the powerful Purity Distilling Company. This tank was an absolute behemoth. It stood over 50 feet tall, spanning 90 feet across, and cast a permanent dark shadow over the small tenement houses below. And inside its cold, riveted metal walls sat 2.3 million gallons, over 8 million liters, of pure, thick, raw molasses. Today, when we hear the word molasses, our minds immediately go to baking. We think of it merely as a dark, sweet syrup used for gingerbread cookies or holiday treats. But in the early 1900s, it was a highly profitable, vital industrial component. When fermented in massive quantities, it produced industrial alcohol. And that alcohol was heavily used by the military to manufacture dynamite, smokeless powder, and high explosives during the brutal years of the war. To meet the massive, lucrative wartime demands, the Boston tank had been built in a desperate, negligent rush in 1915. The man who oversaw its entire construction, Arthur Gell, wasn't even a structural engineer. He was a finance man, a treasurer whose only goal was to save the company money. Because of his relentless cost-cutting, he skipped the most basic safety tests. The steel plates used for the walls were significantly thinner than what was required for a tank of that immense size. He didn't even bother to fill the tank with water to check for structural integrity and leaks before declaring it ready for the heavy syrup. And from the very day it was constructed, the people of the North End knew deep down that something was terribly, fundamentally wrong with it. It leaked constantly. In fact, it leaked so badly that local children would regularly bring small buckets and cups to the base of the towering structure to scrape off the sweet, brown syrup trickling down the sides for a free treat. Instead of properly reinforcing the fragile steel or fixing the dangerous seams, the corporate owners did something unbelievably arrogant and negligent. They simply painted the entire tank brown so the massive leaks wouldn't be as visible to the public eye. But they couldn't hide the sound. Whenever the tank was freshly filled to the brim with warm molasses arriving from ships in the Caribbean, the immense pressure of millions of gallons of heavy liquid would cause the thin metal walls to groan, creak, and violently shudder. Locals described the sound as a deep, metallic heartbeat, a continuous, terrifying rumble that literally shook the ground beneath their feet and kept the neighborhood awake at night. The tank wasn't just storing molasses, it was a ticking time bomb, sitting right in America's backyard, surrounded by thousands of sleeping families. And the fuse for this unprecedented disaster was finally lit on January 15, 1919. After days of freezing, bitter cold, the weather in Boston suddenly and drastically shifted. The temperature rapidly spiked from near zero to a highly unusual 41 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the massive, poorly constructed steel structure, the raw molasses began to ferment and rapidly expand in the sudden warmth of the winter sun. The thermal expansion created a massive, deadly buildup of carbon dioxide gas. The internal pressure pushing against the poorly riveted, groaning steel walls grew to an astronomical, unimaginable level. The tank had been filled to absolute capacity just days before, and it simply couldn't hold the strain any longer. At approximately 12:30 in the afternoon, while the city was enjoying a rare, sunny lunch break and the streets were packed with deliverymen and playing children, the monster finally gave way. Eyewitnesses later reported hearing a sharp, terrifying sound like a rapid-fire machine gun echoing across the waterfront. Pop, 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 pop. It was the enormous steel rivets instantly snapping under the immense pressure and shooting out of the tank like deadly metallic shrapnel, piercing nearby buildings. A split second later, the ground violently shook. The citizens of Boston heard a deafening, earth-shattering roar, followed by a sound that defied all human logic. A deep, low growl of millions of gallons of thick liquid being violently unleashed all at once. The tank didn't just break, it catastrophically exploded, tearing its massive half-inch thick steel walls into twisted, jagged shards of metal weighing tons, launching them hundreds of feet into the air. And then the wave came. A terrifying, towering tsunami of dark brown molasses 25 feet high, equivalent to a two-story building, surged into the densely populated streets. It was moving at an astonishing, inescapable speed of 35 miles per hour. This wasn't a flood of water. Molasses is 40% heavier and vastly more dense than water. It didn't just flow around objects, it violently crushed them with unimaginable kinetic energy. The sheer force of the dark, sticky wave was absolutely apocalyptic. It instantly snapped the thick steel girders of the adjacent elevated railway, twisting them like wire and causing a passenger train to nearly plunge off the tracks into the chaos below. It picked up a fully manned brick firehouse, Engine Company 31, right off its heavy foundation, crushing the building and trapping the brave firemen inside like a fragile wooden toy. Entire buildings and homes were swept off the map, reduced to splintered firewood in mere seconds. Heavy horse-drawn wagons, early automobiles, and dozens of pedestrians were instantly swallowed by the boiling, dark mass. Take the terrifying story of young Anthony Di Stasio. He was walking home from the Michelangelo school when the towering wave suddenly scooped him up. He was carried tumbling and sliding for almost a city block, entirely submerged in the dark, suffocating syrup. He was only saved when a heroic sailor managed to pull him from the deadly current, though Anthony was so coated in molasses that his own mother didn't recognize him at the hospital until she frantically wiped the sweet mud from his face. The terror of being caught in the flood was uniquely horrifying. As the massive wave crashed over the neighborhood and spread out, the rapidly cooling winter air caused the hot molasses to instantly thicken. It turned from a fast-moving, destructive river into a dense, suffocating glue. Men, women, children, and horses found themselves trapped in a terrifying, sticky quicksand. They couldn't swim in it. They couldn't walk through it. The more they struggled to breathe or free their limbs, the deeper they were pulled into the dark, sweet-smelling abyss. When the initial violent wave finally settled, the north end of Boston looked like a bizarre, apocalyptic wasteland. The water of the nearby harbor was stained completely brown. An eerie, unnatural silence fell over the ruined streets, broken only by the muffled cries of the trapped and the overpowering, suffocating, sickly sweet stench of raw sugar that filled the air for miles. The rescue efforts that followed were agonizingly slow, heroic, and incredibly dangerous. Police officers, firefighters, Red Cross nurses, and Navy sailors from nearby docked ships rushed into the disaster zone. But the moment they stepped into the ruins, they found themselves waist-deep in the rapidly hardening syrup, completely unable to move or lift their feet. They had to frantically use salt water pumped directly from the harbor and dry sand from the streets to cut through the thick glaze just to reach the victims. As night fell, the temperature plummeted back below freezing, turning the molasses from a sticky trap into solid, impenetrable rock. Rescuers reported the haunting sight of victims completely encased in the brown syrup, looking like tragic, glazed statues frozen in time under the moonlight. The Great Molasses Flood claimed the lives of 21 innocent people and severely injured over 150 more. And the nightmare didn't end when the victims were found. The cleanup effort was an absolute, unimaginable undertaking that took weeks of backbreaking labor. Hundreds of workers scoured the streets, using fire hoses pumping high-pressure salt water to cut through the hardened molasses, sweeping it down the gutters and straight into Boston Harbor. The harbor water remained stained a murky, unnatural brown all the way until the summer. But the sticky menace spread far beyond the north end. Rescue workers, police, and curious onlookers accidentally tracked the molasses on their boots and clothes into every corner of Boston. It got onto the seats of the elevated trains, the handset of every public telephone, and the floors of hundreds of homes. 4 months, it seemed like the entire city of Boston was coated in a thin, sticky film that simply refused to wash away. The disaster completely destroyed a vibrant, hard-working neighborhood, but the furious citizens of the North End refused to be silenced by the tragedy. They banded together and launched one of the first massive, successful class-action lawsuits against a major corporation in American history. The greedy United States Industrial Alcohol Company tried to dodge responsibility. They attempted to blame the massive explosion on Italian anarchists and imaginary dynamite planted by saboteurs. But after years of grueling court battles featuring hundreds of expert testimonies, the absolute truth of their corporate negligence and Arthur Jelf's deadly cost-cutting was exposed to the world. They were forced to pay massive settlements to the grieving families. But more importantly, the disaster fundamentally transformed American engineering. Before the Great Molasses Flood, anyone could build massive industrial structures without proper oversight. But because of this horrific tragedy, Boston, and soon the rest of the country, passed strict new building codes. Suddenly, every structural plan had to be meticulously calculated, stamped, and approved by registered, professional engineers and architects. The lives lost in the sticky flood essentially bought the safety regulations that protect every American city today. To this day, local legends say that on a very hot, humid summer afternoon in the north end of Boston, if the wind blows just right off the harbor, you can still catch the faint, sickly sweet scent of molasses rising from the old cobblestones. It serves as a ghostly reminder of the day the streets turned into a dark, suffocating trap, and a chilling testament to the fact that human hubris and corporate greed can turn even the most ordinary substances into weapons of absolute destruction. Had you ever heard of this bizarre and terrifying disaster before today? If you suddenly saw a two-story wave of anything coming down your street, what would be your absolute first instinct? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to share your own local history with us. Your history is America's history and we want to hear it.